Well, good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome to another session, to be precise, session number 7 of MEG 5. I welcome you all. Let's get started. Today, we'll be discussing Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault, and hopefully, we'll follow it up with Jacques Derrida. So, before we get started with, I would again like to share a couple of small videos with you, and I'll tell you why once we complete watching them.
On the TV. Switch on the TV. What do you see? The breaking news graphic, the scrolling text, the news presenter behind the desk. Read the signs, the hair, the makeup, the suit. What is this story about? The rhythm of the words, numbers, colors. Why are these codes here? The music, the size of the letters. How do you feel? A news bulletin is a selection of signs, the flow of words, read of the autocue, the artifice of the presenter's cadence, the news voice, the gaze looking right at you but through a lens, visual standings for credibility, authority, legitimacy, rhetorical motifs constructing the biggest myth of all, that what we are watching is unmediated reality. This is what Roland Barthes would have seen. The TV screen as a cultural text, and he would have unveiled its myths. Because to read symbols and signs, to interpret them, is the work of a semiotician. In the 1950s, Barthes started writing about popular culture. In his book Mythologies, he gathered multiple discordant subjects: food, horoscopes, religion, advertising, toys, photography, detergents. He saw these as elements of mass culture, imbued with ideology, providing society with the myths that once came from fables and epics. Barthes said, the starting point of these reflections was usually a feeling of impatience at the sight of the naturalness with which newspapers, art, and common sense constantly dress up a reality which is undoubtedly determined by history. Barthes didn't just spotlight the myths that surround us. He put back the curtain on their ideological premises. He warned us against taking all that surrounds us at face value. The fonts in your daily newspaper, they don't just reflect meaning, they add it, they change it. The framing of this shot, what's the history behind it? The selfie, the latest representation of the bourgeois individual. The stick, a seal of authenticity, of status. The subtitle, the voice as text. What could be more Barthesian?
Welcome to the MCAT Multimedia Series, a MCAT analysis of Roland Barthes' Mythologies. How can dominant ideologies successfully present themselves as simply the way the world should be? The French theorist Roland Barthes thought they did so by appropriating popular culture and repurposing it. He believed they drained popular ideas of their real meaning and then repackaged them to create myths that carried new and often very different implications. Writing in Mythologies, a collection of essays published in 1957, Barthes looked at examples drawn from everyday French life, from advertisements to the world of wrestling. His aim was to show that images, which he called signs, were stripped of meaning when they were removed from their proper context. The result, he thought, was the spread of a uniform, unthreatening, and above all, bourgeois ideology, a comfort blanket of myth that might be cozy and reassuring, but could easily prove stifling. To understand what Barthes meant, consider the iconic image of a charismatic revolutionary. What did he really stand for? How has he been depicted in popular culture? And what does his iconic image represent today? Barthes argues that the signs that society projects onto our revolutionary bear very little relation to his actual qualities. The reality was that he was willing to kill to achieve political aims, and that the state he helped to forge was more repressive and less free than his public statements might suggest. Stripped of this context, though, his image becomes a sign with other uses. It can exploit consumers' eagerness to identify with qualities that they believe symbolize youthfulness, rebelliousness, hatred of authority. Companies that exploit the image, Bart explains, introduce a second-order signification, a new myth, one that symbolizes something different. It's an image drained of real meaning, one that no longer refers to the revolutionaries' real beliefs. Before long, the famous photograph is appropriated to sell all sorts of products: t-shirts, beer, even washing powder. So when Sophia goes to a shop and buys a t-shirt with our revolutionary's face on it, she thinks she's making a statement about her individualism, rebellion, and anti-capitalism, when in truth, the image is now a capitalist commodity. By buying the t-shirt, she buys into that conformity. It's a sort of rebellion her bourgeois society is happy to live with. Popular culture has taken a real person whose real ideas posed real danger and turned him into an image which, Bart would point out, has been safely reinvented as myth. Roland Barthes' writings have had a huge influence on the ways that critics seek to deconstruct and examine meaning. A more detailed examination of his ideas.
All right, so good evening, learners, and finally, here we are in our seventh session of MEG 5, and let us slowly get started. Yes, quite a lot of videos to get started with today. As I told you, if we start on time, 5:25, 5:30, then it gives us time to play a song and relax and get started with. So thankfully, last 2-3 days, we have been starting before time, so I'm able to help you out in feeling relaxed. The two other videos that I played, you may be slightly wondering, what is the context? Even though this is a seventh session, and even though you have generally been benevolent, especially in terms of lavishing praises or being appreciative of the lectures, there are times when sometimes my learners do ask me as to why is it that, given the fact that we have limited number of sessions, we only get 10 sessions, 20 hours to cover the entire paper. Why is it that I bring in a lot of allusions and digressions compared to the texts that are prescribed for study? So in my defense, rally a futuristic defense. So I'd like to begin today by that defense. As students of IGNU, more often than not, you lack a lot of things which a regular learner has. I'm not saying that regular learners are really good and they get all the best lectures and they end up being extremely informative. My personal opinion is that my IGNO learners are far scholarly than most of those who go to the college every day. From my experience teaching in IGNO in almost close to a decade now. But still, there is this popular misconception wherein especially students from IGNU believe that they don't get too many classes, so they don't get to learn a lot of things. They have to depend on their language and understanding to understand concepts. So more often your reading is limited to the blocks that are sent to you, or maybe some basic minimalistic readings of the content available in the World Wide Web. So often what happens is when you go for an interview, there's this stereotypical notion about IGNO learners, and the stereotypical notion backfires on you when they ask you, talk to me about a favorite author and a favorite work, or a theorist, a popular theorist that you were fascinated with. So more often than not, even the regular ongoing learners, what they do is they pick up a learner from a particular age that they have studied. Let's say, for instance, initially when I used to go for interviews, I used to take the name of John Dryden or Alexander Pope because I was quite thorough with neoclassical age. And I had read Mac Flecknoe as well as Epistle to Dr. Arthur Note. So when my interviewer asked me to name an author and a work that I'm fascinated with, I took these names. And the immediate response was, this is something that you have already studied. Okay, talk to us about 3 other works by Alexander Pope, or 3 other works by Dryden, or Derrida, or Roland Barthes. And then to a certain extent, most of the learners go blank because we have quite a lot to chew within the syllabus, and more often than not we don't go beyond the syllabus. So there is a problem, or there is a slight handicap that we have in terms of understanding the concepts properly. So as I begin this particular day, let's say day 7, of course, but generally it happens on day 6 or day 7 in a streak based on where my syllabi is. So I generally ask my learners, I give them a two chance option or two choices. I tell them, do you want a lecture which is matter of fact, straightforward, simple today, or do you want a lecture which is completely confusing, chaotic, and full of jargons? Needless to say, students choose the former than the latter, and I tell them that it's okay, I'll do that today, but nonetheless, tomorrow or the next class, we'll have to deal with the latter being Jacques Derrida. But today, the former being Roland Barthes. I'm not giving you that choice because yesterday we dealt with Saussure, and we have to anyhow follow up with Foucault. So Foucault and Barthes would go together hand in hand. So I thought, let me begin with Roland Barthes. So what is it with Roland Barthes? Why did I play these two videos initially? Is something you may wonder. So talking about Roland Barthes, there are two works that are prescribed for your immediate study. One is from work to text, an extract from work to text, and the other one is the death of the author. So these two works are prescribed for study. And generally, stereotypically, these two works are prescribed for study. At least the death of the author is prescribed for study during the PG days, during the post-graduation days. And more often than not, an average learner who's out of his studies, of his MA, into the job market, recognizes Roland Barthes only as someone who has written the death of the author, or the perception that he puts forward in that essay. Whereas Roland Barthes, unlike many other writers that we come across, if you remember yesterday, I played a poem by John Crowe Ransom, just to make you realize that he is also into poems. So similarly, Roland Barthes is someone who wrote extremely voraciously on various topics. And whatever he wrote, he struck gold. Like people read his essays and they could relate to it. They could find something out of it. So Roland Barthes was one such literary genius who had a lot to say about a lot of things happening around him. Some of you, at least some of you, may remember this essay called Toys, written by Roland Barthes, prescribed mostly for the undergraduate learners. During your undergraduate days, you would have come across this essay by Roland Barthes titled Toys. So what is the Toys all about? The Toys basically speaks about gender discrimination and how it starts right from the toys that we buy for our children, the toys that we give or gift to boys, and the toys that we give to girls, and how that forms in the gendered phenomena or in making a sexual orientation explicit in a conditioning manner. So Roland Barthes' Toys is one such essay that you may otherwise remember. So for the time being, I just wanted you to be aware of the fact that Roland Barthes has written a masterpiece work called Mythology. I may come back to that later if and when I get time to talk about Sir Sigmund Freud. Because when I speak about Freud, I may also speak a little bit about Lacan and Claude Lévi-Strauss. So then maybe in order to bring in myth criticism, I may slightly draw examples from Roland Barthes as well, at a later point of time, that is. Apart from that, another book that comes to my mind is Camera Lucida. It was one of the last works of Roland Barthes. Just in case you have the reading habit, and if you get excited by reading different subjects, then Camera Lucida is a work that I would recommend you to read. Why? Because Camera Lucida talks about the politics of photographs. How a photograph image may represent a particular person, or we may believe or disbelieve that it represents a person. What Roland Barthes calls as spectrum. And how that spectrum is actually a representation, a mere representation of our past. He speaks about his mother's photograph. Given the fact that his mother passed away, that photo becomes a nostalgic piece to look at and admonish a frozen moment of her at a particular time. And he also speaks about the significance of photographs, especially when it comes to war scenarios. Okay, so I just wanted you to be familiar with this various sides of Roland Barthes, and I'm sure those two videos were quite explicit enough to understand the mythological perspective put forward by Roland Barthes. It is very significant for an understanding, for a proper understanding of Roland Barthes. The reason why I'm saying all this is because if you have read the blocks, The Death of the Author is an essay which talks about the literal killing of author and the meaning production, the role of meaning production vested with the reader. Such a concept may primarily seem to be absurd, meaningless, or less comprehensible. And by the time you complete reading that work, you may recognize that we can't completely agree with Barthes. Like somebody asked me, I think someone asked me yesterday about new critics and how far it is. I think it's Param who asked me how far it is relevant to the modern days, because it seems quite absurd, because they are appealing only to the aesthetic part, not to the imaginary part. Similarly, when we speak about Roland Barthes' concepts in that particular essay, that is the author, the problem is that we may find it slightly less agreeable to, apart from certain parts, and given the fact that he brings in this scenario where he tries to break free from certain traditions, there is nothing much to, in that sense, side with Roland Barthes. But still it's significant because in terms of theory, he introduces a new parlance with which we can approach our methodology. Yeah. So that's why I wanted you to be aware of his other different selves, which may also come in handy when it comes to his appreciation. Also, apart from work to text and the death of the author, you must be also aware of his works like S bar Z. And S bar Z is significant also because of these discussions on the presence or absence or the life or the death of the author. Sorry, S bar Z, I'm sorry, not R. S bar Z. So that's another work that you need to be aware of before we get into detail with Roland Barthes. Also, before proceeding to these two works, another word of caution is that the reason why I showed mythology is also because up until Saussure, even in Saussure when we discussed him yesterday, you would remember that they are looking at the primacy of language. And when they say language, they speak about words ordered into units through a proper grammatical structure or rules and regulations. So it is Roland Barthes who rather looks at, in that sense, a logocentric approach to literature. Or he tries to deconstruct the logocentric approach to literature. He tries to decipher images or photographs or the visual culture that is across us. So I would like to get started before going on to Roland Barthes, just because I just suddenly remembered. I'd like to get started with this discussion on logocentrism. Somebody had asked me about logocentrism yesterday. So I thought to make it very simple, I would just read from your own blocks 2.5.3. If you want to go and have a look at it later, page number 25, 2.5.3, has a great, simplified definition of what logocentrism is. So in order to understand Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Derrida, to whom I'll come back later, I'd say that a proper understanding of logocentrism would be required. I hope I'm not confusing you too much with this introduction. I know this introduction is slightly getting longer, but that's also because such a pre-anticipation would help you to go back and reread them better, rather than understanding that right now. Yes, Monica, do you have a question? Why so sorry? Monica ji? Okay, that's fine. Not a problem. So yeah, I was trying to say that such a slightly longer introduction is also because it will give you a proper way to get back and look back at these particular writers So regarding these three people, an understanding of what logocentrism is very much essential. So let's get started with what logocentrism is. So your study material, your block would quote Derrida. Just like Derrida says, just as Western philosophy has been phonocentric, it has been in a broader sense logocentric. So what is logocentric? The word logocentric has its inception from the Greek word logos, referred to cosmic reason, regarded as a source of world order. So Derrida can thus be interpreted as saying that philosophy has always been centered on reason, which gives validity to all operations, acts as an unexamined center. If we examine the operations of these reasons closely, it can be seen to create some ultimate presence, truth, or reality, to act as unassailable foundation on which the whole discourses can be built. A great number of candidates for this role, God, the idea, the world spirit, have been thrust from time to time. This unexamined center then creates a hierarchy, assumes the priority of the first term, and conceives the second as a complication, negation, or a deficient form of the first. I'll give you another example, if it's confusing to you, just a simple example. In order to enforce systems to our brains, we always look at a center. Later, when we discuss Derrida next week, we'll come to this thing, the question of center, its existence or non-existence. So we'll come to Derrida later. Fatima, we are discussing Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault today. But because we left out logocentrism yesterday, I'm getting started with a definition on logocentrism. And I started with Derrida's definition, but then that's more simpler for the time being. So let's say we want to establish something. So we need a center. Take the case of a college. Who's the center of a college or a school? We look at the principal or manager as the center of an institution. Then that center creates a hierarchy. If there is a manager or a director, then there is a principal. Then there is a vice principal. Then there are a group of teachers. So that hierarchy is created by the system to run the system. And this, in a way, until structuralism, a stereotypical way of looking at things. When it comes to literary analysis, for that sake, when we think of a text, we think about a structure, an immanent structure. When we think about a text, we think about meaning generation. We look for specific attributes in a language or in a text that is produced. We also look at proper structures, including titles, subheadings, blah, blah, blah. So such an attempt is also an attempt that includes logocentrism. Okay, so I repeat that. If you examine the operations of this reason closely, it can be seen to create some ultimate presence, truth, or reality, to act as an unassailable foundation on which all discourses can be built. A great number of candidates for this role, God, the idea, the world spirit, have been thrust from time to time. This unexamined center then creates a hierarchy, assumes the priority of the first term, and conceives the second as a complication, negation, or a deficient form of the first. For example, religion as a discourse relies on the unquestioned primary status of God and arbitrarily devalues man as a complication, negation, or a deficient form of God. Especially from a biblical vantage point of view, you could see that as God as a creator of everything and man as a sinner. Since each of these centers hopes to found the whole system of thought, it must itself go beyond the system. It cannot be implicated in the very thought which it attempts to order. It must somehow be anterior to them. That is, God should exist independently outside religion. Because the moment the God is placed within the context, then the God becomes human. Take the case of any number of avatar Purushas that we have in the Indian mythology. Sri Krishna has to die, no matter with a bow being hit in his leg. So that is something that logocentrism is about. And any such transcendental entity is a fiction in one consequence of the post-structuralist theory of language. There is no concept that is not shot with traces and fragments of other ideas. It is just that out of this play of signifiers, again, that might be confusing to you. We'll come back to that when we discuss Derrida, the play of signifiers. For the time being, we know signifier as a Saussurean concept, but Derrida speaks about an interplay between the signifiers to create meaning. Okay, so it is just that out of the play of signifiers, certain messages, certain meanings are elevated by ideologies to a privileged position around which other meanings are forced to turn. Consider in our own society, freedom, democracy, order, and so on. Often, they seem to be the origin of all other meanings in our life, but when investigated, they turn out to be themselves derived from other ideas or concepts. So this is critical to the post-structuralists. Well, in that sense, don't think that Barth is a post-structuralist. Barth began as a structuralist and later emerged as a post-structuralist. In that sense, he is a transition critic. Nobody has used that word, it's my coinage. If you can call those poets transitional poets, then Roland Barthes is a transitional critic. He started with structuralism, became a post-structuralist by his latter period. So I hope logocentrism is clear to you. Phonocentrism, phone means word. So word-centric, grammatical-centric approach to literary criticism. So these are two things that I wanted you to be aware of before we get started with Roland Barthes. So finally, we are into finishing the coffee that's been trying to get cool over the last 30 minutes. And get started with Roland Barthes. So we'll be discussing 3 works as I told you. I'll come back to that. Don't worry, Preeti Agarwalji. Later, when we come to Derrida, we have to discuss all this in detail. Phonocentrism, logocentrism, the teleology, archaeology, a lot of things has to be discussed when we come to Derrida. The reason why I didn't take Derrida, let me once more explain that as well before beginning. The reason why I didn't take Derrida today is also because we don't have class for the next 3-4 days. We'll regroup again only next Tuesday, 5:30 p.m. So the problem is, just in case 2 hours fall short for Derrida, it happens because Derrida is quite confusing. So there might be interruptions from your part much more than usual. So you may keep asking for explanations and it will become quite more obligatory for me to clarify that. And it may take sometimes 2.5 to 3 hours. Sometimes 2 hours would be good enough. Again, depends on how much I am able to put forward and how much you are able to comprehend. So that's why I didn't attempt Derrida today. Roland Barthes comparatively can be completed in 20 to 30 minutes or even an hour or an hour and a half. So that's why I ventured out with Roland Barthes today. I'll come back to phonocentrism either when we discuss in the last 15 minutes or when we discuss Derrida. Because for Roland Barthes, phonocentrism doesn't matter for the time being. So, yeah. So, talking about Roland Barthes or coming to Roland Barthes, there are 3 works that we'll discuss today. When I say 3, you may slightly raise your eyebrows and say, we only have 2, right? From writing to text, from work to text and the death of the author. But the thing is, the death of the author, in a way, the interpretation of death of the author or analysis of death of the author also involves the work called S. Bar Said. It also involves a speech by Foucault called What is an Author? I come to that later. So let's, without much ado, let's get started with Roland Barthes. So talking about from work to text, I'm not going to get into detail regarding work to text, but in from work to text, Roland Barthes tried to distinguish between these 2 terms, work and text. They may seemingly sound synonymous to you. A work and text. What is the difference between a work and a text? Is something that you may ponder. But Roland Barthes makes clear distinctions between work and text and tries to identify how a text is different in meaning production and especially in terms of its reading methodologies in particular. So how to read a text as different from a work is something that he tries to speak about. Again, it's a deconstructive analysis by Roland Barthes, and he tries to speak about how the people in his era are looking at text from a different notion, as different from the structuralists or the pre-structuralist era. Also, one more thing or a word of caution that I have for you is the reason why you may find Barthes, Foucault, or Derrida confusing and complex is also because they are waging a battle against the specificity or fixity of meaning. A summary, for instance, is a specific thing, it's a fixed thing, it's a factual thing. Barthes, Derrida, Foucault, and so on, also the postmodernists and post-structuralists, they speak about a lack of inherent meaning, or the possibility of change and shifts in meaning, of meaning being in a flux. Hence, when we read them, we may find it slightly difficult, especially in work to text. Roland Barthes doesn't try to define text in a conclusive manner. Why so? Because that will be undoing himself. Because he's trying to say that there is no fixed definition. Meaning is in a flux. Later, Derrida also says that. No. It is not in that manner. You may go back to your blogs and maybe read 3.2, 3.2.1. It has very simply detailed what is the difference between work and text. So he tries to locate text at a slightly higher range, wherein he tries to give in quite a lot of specificity to the reading of the text. Or just to read a little bit of it, he says that the work is tied to one signified. In other words, to read a work is to practice the Saussurean stability of the signified, or to revel in the possibility of a fixed meaning. And how do you fix meanings? That's something Saussure didn't really indulge deep into. So meaning can be fixed in two ways. On the one hand, one can attribute straight literal meaning to the words. That is what we call as denotative meanings. On the other side, we have connotative meanings or implied meanings. We look into the text and we try to decipher something. And the work would pose a challenge. On the other hand, we can assume that the meaning is fixed but hidden. So there is something deeper than straight and literal meaning. Thus, we have schools of theories like Freudian. Bharti Mishraji, you may please log out and log in. If there is an issue in listening, that must be a network issue from your end. Log out and log in. And I hope you will be able to listen to me better. Okay, so yeah, in case everyone is feeling it, please let me know. There could be a technical error from my end as well. It's raining heavily outside, so there is a possibility that my network is being slightly unstable as well. I mean, unstable.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so when there is a meaning that lies deep and is beyond what is visible to the primary reading, then that brings in the schools of thought. Marxism, feminism, and different other schools of thought which looks into a text from a particular perspective. The text, on the contrary, practices the infinite deferral of the signified by inviting us to defer meaning. Barthes reminds us of all we have read while deconstructing the signifier and signified, that is the production of meaning through difference that Derrida speaks of chromatology. So if he says that the infinitude or infinite play of the signifier does not imply that meaning is something unnameable, beyond language, but the idea that fixity is not part of its identity. In the context of reading, this perpetual play of signifiers should not be thought of as leading from a surface to a deeper level of meaning, but merely undirected and unpurposive movement. The logic that governs the reading of a text is not that of comprehension. Maybe you read a work for comprehension, but the reading of a text is not merely for comprehension, that is to find what it exactly means, but to merely revel in the free play of its signifiers. This free play is generated by the symbolic rather than referential status of language. The symbolic status of language and hence of the text is the product of the divorce between the word and the world, an idea you encountered in Saussure's theory of language. Language does not connect directly with the reality, and a text creates a plane of its own, inhabited by forces different from the real. A work whose integrally symbolic nature one conceives, perceives, and receives is a text, according to Barth. He also goes on to speak about the pluralism or the pluralistic nature of a text. And also, another distinction I want to bring in is between doxa or doha and paradoxical. Doxa, DOXA, refers to a commonly accepted opinion, or to be more specific, public opinion. Therefore, paradoxical means something which goes beyond commonly accepted opinions. In claiming that the text goes beyond the limits of doxa, and Barth wants to imply that in containing the play of a number of interpretations, a text always tends to go beyond what is commonly accepted notion of a work, genre, or type of writing. This liberation of the text from a fixed center, which holds the work together, gives it a subversive potential through which it continually challenges all boundaries set up commonly accepted opinions or theories. The text, in other words, always calls into question all pre-existing assumptions about its meaning. It is in these grounds that Barth writes that what constitutes a text is its subversive force with regard to old classification. So this is in gist what he speaks about in From Work to Text. And the reason why I spoke this out is also about the difference between how work is interpreted and text is interpreted. Work is always the stereotypical, looking at the meaning generation, the structure. We saw it all the schools, including structuralism, pre-structural school like new criticism and so on. But here, Barth is trying to speak about texts and how they are open-ended, they are inconclusive in terms of interpretation, so that we can relish in them and come out with our own interpretations. Maybe just in case you are confused, let me give you a simple example. The moment you look at a particular work as belonging to a particular genre, let's say you take the Sherlock Holmes fiction by Arthur Conan Doyle, and you say that this particular work is a detective fiction, it becomes a work rather than a text. You read the Hound of the Baskerville, or The Empty Prison, or any other Sherlock Holmes stories. That becomes a work, not a text, because you are looking for what is in it, the story part, and the interpretation is based on that. But then, if it be considered a text, yes, it can also be considered as a text. How? As a feminist researcher, you try to look into the early detective fiction written by Charles Dickens, no, not Dickens, I'm sorry, Edgar Allan Poe, or Arthur Conan Doyle, or even Agatha Christie, or any other writer, and you wonder why all these detectives are men. And in such an analysis, you try to infer and engage in several other socio-political factors. Maybe you decipher that these characters are men because the particular society would acknowledge a male chauvinistic or machoistic protagonist. Or in the society that women lived in at that particular time, it was impossible for a domesticated woman to become a detective, probably. So you may make your own inferences, and such an array of possibilities is what a text would present to you. So this in particular is what Barth is trying to speak about. And because of this binary or chronology or distinction that Barth makes, needless to say, the text becomes more significant than a work, because the text is not close-ended, it is open-ended, it is available for interpretations. You may take a look at it and arrive at different observations. You can look at, again, Sherlock Holmes as a product of a capitalist book market prodigy. You could say that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote just to make money, and he made a male hero, a stereotypical hero. He was smoking a pipe, which is part of the popular culture of then Britain, and Sherlock Holmes arrived. So such an interpretation would again become a Marxian interpretation. For example, if you add some Marxian terminologies, it becomes a Marxian interpretation. So that becomes a text in that particular context, and the text, in that sense, is put in a higher pedestal than a work. I hope I'm clear and sensible to you. Maybe this is my interpretation. Don't go to an exam paper and write, okay, Anand sir said that Sherlock Holmes is a typical example where it is normally regarded as a work as long as it's a detective fiction. But then the moment we look at a Marxian analysis and say it is a capitalist hero with a pipe, then it becomes a text. Well, you can do that, but then that is my interpretation. I'm not sure how far experts would agree to it. This is my way of making things simpler for you. All right. Now, let's very quickly move on to Roland Barthes and his famous, popular, controversial, The Death of the Author. And while we speak about the death of the author, again, there requires some basic interpretations of what went behind this particular work. Yeah. So what went behind this particular work? So you have Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, all French philosophers. Mind you, they have nothing to do with literature. They have nothing to do with literary theory per se. They were more into philosophical expeditions, and their approach and their propositions were related to philosophy. And because we can have them in our literary space, we draw them to literature and we try to put it into literary analysis. So always be wary about this. Also, they wrote and spoke in French, and whatever we read is in English translation. So that's something we need to always keep in mind, and that's why certain words cause problems to us. Okay, so speaking about Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author, the essay was written in the year 1967, and it later appeared in his book, a collection of essays called Image, Music and Text, published in the year 1977. Years are immaterial because much before that there was a conference in which Roland Barthes presented this paper along with Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. No, not Foucault, with Derrida. So there was a conference in which he, in San Francisco, if I remember correctly, in which he delivered this lecture, and he tried to present this conception of death of the author and the birth of the reader, wherein readers' evaluations matter. But then, in that same essay, we could see Derrida presenting on structure, sign, and play. And then Derrida presented, and it so happened that Michel Foucault, who was the teacher, walked out. And later, because that was in contrast to Barthes' statement, so he was more fond of Barthes, and he didn't like Derrida's postulations. And later he came up with a lecture, What is an Author? Partially defending Roland Barthes' theories on death of the author, filling into the limitations of his work. And that was followed by S bar Z, as well as the subsequent publications of Roland Barthes. The publication history is significant because there are also people who say that Barthes being Foucault's disciple, this concept actually belongs to Foucault, and it is Foucault who actually brought this forward, and Barthes followed it up. So there is a ongoing debate regarding this. So to have an idea of publication history would help you place yourself in any of these sites. All right. Whew. Okay. So the death of the author. So what is the death of the author all about? I've been speaking for a long time, so maybe I'll keep mum for a couple of minutes. For those who have read the essay, it's time for you to open up and speak about the death of the author. Yes, please go on, Preeti.
So one line answer. So, so actually
Yeah,
it
that will be
talk
fine enough.
about like we as a reader are open to interpret the work. The moment the author puts his pen down, at that moment only his work is accomplished. Now it's up to the readers to interpret how they use theories and all to interpret the text. It's all about.
Okay, good observation. Would anybody like to add to that something based on what you have read in the blogs? If you remember the day before, I told you that romanticism or romantic criticism is something that you could simply walk in and write without any proper preparations. Uh, Roland Barthes and his Death of the Author is more like Waiting for Godot. What connects Death of the Author with Waiting for Godot? Waiting for Godot can be summed up by its subtitle. Nobody comes, nothing happens, nobody goes. Similarly, Roland Barthes, just like Priti Agarwal ji said, can be summed up in a single line. The author is dead and the reader is born. So actually, it is very easy in that sense to approach these works. Okay, before continuing with the Death of the Author, let me also, yes, Sonali ji, go on. I could see your hand raised. Sonali ji? All right, I think it's by mistake. Okay, so the other day while discussing new criticism, I forgot to mention two terminologies by Wimsatt and Beardsley. Wimsatt and Beardsley put forward two concepts called affective fallacy and intentional fallacy. Needless to say, fallacy means a mistake, an error that we may make inadvertently or advertently. So these are two words that people may confuse. Sometimes this is asked as short note for your exam or assignments. So what is affective fallacy and what is intentional fallacy? I'm not going to go into a detailed analysis. I'll just finish it in a line, just like Priti Agarwal ji said. So intentional fallacy states that author's intentions are irrelevant, and affective fallacy states that reader responses are immaterial. So there are two concepts. Intentional fallacy, which says that author's intentions are irrelevant for the interpretation of a text, and affective fallacy says that reader responses are immaterial. There's also one more called historical fallacy, which is basically disregarding biographical criticism. The historical facts pertaining to text are irrelevant. So when it comes to post-structural criticism, you can see these people critiquing all these things. So we begin with, we begin with Roland Barthes, The Death of the Author. I'll try to keep it as simple as possible because otherwise it can be kind of
Sir,
confusing.
can you
Yes,
please
please.
repeat this affective fallacy that reader's response is?
Immaterial. Intentional fallacy, author intentions are immaterial. Affective fallacy, reader responses are immaterial. When it comes for a short note in your exam hall, just in case you get confused between the two, how would you remember? There are quite a lot of learners who end up writing affective fallacy for intentional fallacy and intentional fallacy for affective fallacy. So how would you remember that in your exam hall? I have a tip for you. Who has intentions?
So, author.
Author. So the author has an intention, the author has a bias, the author has an agenda. So intentional fallacy would happen with the author. Affective fallacy, who has an affective role in reading or interpreting a text? It is the reader.
We are the readers.
Yeah. So the affective fallacy is committed by the reader. So intentional fallacy and affective fallacy, please do not confuse if it comes for a short note. It could also be like Wimsatt and Beardsley, simply. So then you have to write these things. So if you don't confuse it, yeah. Okay.
So there's one more concept in new criticism, that is organic unity. What is it about?
Organic unity is basic. Well, I'll come to that in the last 15 minutes if you allow me, because otherwise I would just keep digressing and Roland Barthes won't end today. The reason why I took Barthes instead of Derrida is that I could complete it today. Okay. So remind me during the last 15 minutes, I'll definitely come back. Okay. There are two things I think. Before this also somebody asked a question and I said, yeah, phonocentrism. Okay. I'll remember that. Phonocentrism and organic unity. I'll come to that during a Q&A session in the end. Just in case I forget, remind me. Okay. So I'll come to a basic summary of Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. But before doing that, let me also give in a few premises with which we work. And these are terms that may confuse you. The summary won't confuse you as much. But these are certain terminology that you need to be accustomed with that may sometimes confuse you. But this will again follow with the reader because he's speaking about structure, sign, and play. So here, Roland Barthes says that in a stereotypical sense, the text is given a final signified. We are looking for meanings in a text, and the writing is closed. Right? The moment we speak about a text that is writer centric, the writing is closed. We are only looking for inherent meanings, which we call summary, and there is less freedom for the reader to interpret. And the signifying play is arrested. When the writing is closed, the signifying play, hereby play for the time being, I'll elaborate it further when I teach the reader. But for the time being, you conceive play as play between words in order to generate meanings. The interplay between the words or sentences, the patterns. So when the writing is closed, the signifying play gets arrested, which is we cannot further delve deep into those things. And and now let's get into the basic summary of The Death of the Author. You may have read the blocks and you may be aware of this, but I'm running through that because there are certain points that may require an elaboration. It is a short essay by Roland Barthes, and in that he critiques and shakes up the traditional way of approaching and analyzing the text, that is too author-centric, which is too focused in looking for the intentions of the author and analyzing the life and background of the author to unravel the meaning of the text instead of just assessing the content of the text alone. One more thing I forgot to talk to you about is this double inverted commas, or what you may call as quotation marks. More often than not, in his other books, other works, other essays, Barthes also says that this quotation mark actually doesn't exist there. It is the emphasis laid by the author. So I just remind this because it will be required again while I continue with the part. Okay, so he speaks about he disregards the traditional ways where the intentions of the author and analyzing the life and background of the author to unravel the meaning of the text is prevalent. So as the essay opens, he tries to explain the fundamental idea that he lays forward in his essay through the character of Zambianella, taken from Saracen, which is a short story by Balzac. There is the story called Saracen by Balzac, where you have a so-called transgender sort of a protagonist, or a she-male sort of a protagonist. So he speaks about Zambinella, who's that character, in a novella written by Balzac. So talking about Zambinella, who's actually a castrated male disguised as a woman. In Indian history, we have something called Brihanala, if you remember Brihanala's character. Yeah? So something like Brihanala, the opposite of Brihanala perhaps. So talking about the character disguised as a woman, Balzac writes, "It was woman with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive fears, her unprovoked bravado, her daring, and her delicious delicacy of feeling." I am copy pasting exactly from the text. This is how Balzac writes about it. Now, Roland Barthes pauses for a moment and asks us whether it is ever possible to know whose ideas are coming forth in these expressions. Is this the character of that novella speaking? Is it the man Balzac speaking with his preconceived knowledge and prejudice of women? Or is it someone else? Again, let me recontextualize the beginning of Barthes' essay to you. He brings an extract from Balzac where Balzac defines the character who is a castrated male, and he says it was woman with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive fears, her unprovoked bravado, her daring and her delicacy of feeling. I mean, delicious delicacy of feeling. So, is this Balzac speaking with his preconceived knowledge and prejudice of women? Why? He's stereotyping women in that definition. Women with fear, with irrational whims, instinctive fear, right? So, is it Balzac speaking, or is it someone else? So, what Barth does is he's trying to make us realize as a reader is that one can never find for certain through what a particular character is talking. If it is the personal opinion of the author coming through the mouth of that character or someone else. Again, I would like to remind what I said just a while ago. This is something that Wimsett and Beardsley cautions us in terms of intentional fallacy. So Barth also wants the reader to not pay unnecessary attention to the intentions of the author or the real meaning that author was trying to say through his work. According to Barth, the intentions of the author are irrelevant. That is the principle or primary argument put forward by Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes says that the intentions of the author is or are irrelevant. The work isn't an exact replica of his intentions, and in the process of giving words to the thoughts, writer intentionally or unintentionally is involved in the process of meaning making on which he has no complete control as the author or writer isn't a god. Thus, again, we could look back at it and question, because these people are criticizing, the deconstructionists are critical of the logocentric notions. And then Barth draws an analogy with God and author and says that author is not as capable as God, thereby unintentionally bringing in that hierarchy that we were discussing in the beginning of this essay. Okay, so thus the pursuit of trying to figure out the author's intention are a complete distraction and unnecessary, as even if the author is alive, which is not the case several times if the author is dead, one can't be fully certain if the author is genuine about his intentions. I hope that part is clear to you. We shouldn't commit ourselves to intentional fallacy. We shouldn't give in to what the author thinks. To give you a slight example, let's say someone like Pranab Kumar Mukherjee, he's no longer with us, a former president. He has written an autobiography, a few parts. I'm not sure how many of you have read it. But just giving a hypothetical scenario. So Pranab Kumar Mukherjee comes up with a book, if he is alive today, speaking about the downfall of Congress and the rise of BJP, and claiming why or how Congress should come back to power. So at an intentional level, we may tend to look at Pranab Kumar Mukherjee's credentials of being a senior congressman, and we may tend to believe that he has come up with a work to bring back Congress to the mainstream politics. But Barth cautions us against that. Barth says that we can't be so conclusive and sure about author's intentions. We have to rather go through and interpret the work as a whole. Sometimes we may end up realizing that the author is actually being critical of Congress. In Pranab Kumar Mukherjee's autobiography, for instance, he has written contemptuously about Srimati Sonia Gandhi and the then Congress leadership when they made Dr. Manmohan Singh the Prime Minister of India. Pranab Mukherjee was of the opinion that he was expecting to be made the Prime Minister, which they didn't. And according to him, that led to the downfall of Congress rule over the next 10 years. Well, just giving an example. So in that sense, Roland Barthes cautions us from falling prey to the intentional fallacy. He doesn't use that word. Rather, he speaks about how we should be cautious of the author intentions. And then, yeah, he says, even if the author is alive or dead, we should stay away from this. So what is the difference between interpreting the work based on author intentions when author is alive and when author is dead? I'll give you an example. There is this popular poem by Matthew Arnold. Again, G.K. Chesterton's Victorian complacency can be attributed to that poem because it has nothing to do with the Victorian period. The poem is, you may have come across the poem in various titles. On Shakespeare, Mountain. Yeah, I'll come to that. I'll come to that. So on Shakespeare, Mountain. These are certain titles associated with the poem. So in that poem, Matthew Arnold writes like this: "Thou art." I'm speaking from a memory. I could be wrong in terms of the lines. Thou art stands still. They ask and ask and ask. Thou does not answer and simply smile. This is a couple of lines from that poem by Matthew Arnold on William Shakespeare. The line is like this. I'm not sure if it's there in MEG1, so pardon me if I'm again inadvertently taking MEG1. But that lines are like this. Your works or your art or your genius are standing so tall, so heavily. And they keep asking and asking and asking. That is, they keep prodding and prodding and prodding over your genius. They keep challenging. They keep asking, is Shakespeare a legend? They keep throwing their arrows at you. They fling arrows at you. Thou stand still and doesn't answer and simply smile. What is it? They keep throwing arrows at you, questioning your legendary status. You keep smiling and you do not answer. Why? 1,000 points for those who correctly answer this question.
Shakespeare is no more to answer.
Spot on, Param. You're a genius. So Shakespeare is no more. Shakespeare is dead. And imagine where we hang dead people. We hang them in our walls, in a photograph. And what do people in photographs do? They smile. They simply smile. You can do whatever you want. You can even break the frame. They'll keep smiling. So Matthew Arnold says that critics, of course, Shakespeare is popular due to his critics, and all those critics are posthumous. Nobody during Shakespeare's time has interpreted his works the way we read them today. So all the posthumous critics of Shakespeare raised their eyebrows, raised their questions, raised their doubts over his legendary status, even the existence of Shakespeare. But Shakespeare simply stands, does not answer, and smiles because he's dead. He can't answer. So when Barth says, irrespective of whether the author is alive or dead, you should disregard intentional fallacy, is because what's the difference? If you attempt intentional fallacy when the author is alive, you still have a scope to validate. Let's say I write an essay or an article or a story and you give in to my readings, but still at a later point you have a doubt, as if it's the opposite. As long as I am alive, you can come back and validate it with me. But if I am dead, you can definitely not do that, as with Saussure. When we read his theories on linguistics, we are not sure because it's students, their lecture notes that came into as course day general linguistics. So yeah, so he cautions us to not fall prey to these two things. Yes, Navya Devi. Navya?
Hi, sir. I had a little doubt. So, even if an author is alive, and if they've written works across a period of 50 years, their intentions, their ideology when they wrote the book 50 years
Can
ago.
vary, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I think even that could not be a reliable source of their intentions because those could change, or the publicist could have asked them to change.
Very much. There are quite a lot of factors there. So that's why Roland Barthes doesn't give us these causes or these reasons to disregard the fallacy, but rather he cautions us not to take the authorial intentions into account. Again, as I told you, he doesn't use the word intentional fallacy. What he says is, let us disregard the authorial intentions, because then the text cannot be read in its most autonomous sense. I hope that's clear.
Thank you, sir. Thanks.
Yeah. Thus, the pursuit of trying to figure out the author's intentions are a complete distraction and unnecessary even if he is alive. or even if he is no longer there. And in case, even if the author is honestly telling his intentions behind what he has written, there is no guarantee that the author was successfully able to depict that in his work, which would not only show a supposed failure, but in fact add beauty to the text due to various possible interpretations that it might offer. Again, another example that comes to my mind immediately is uh, you all know this popular Malayalam writer, Kamala Das, also known as Madhavi Kuti. So she had written at the peak of her life and career, literary career, her autobiography titled, you study that in
My
MEG
story.
7.
My story.
My story, or in Malayalam, Endekada. So there are quite a lot of open writings about her life in that autobiography. She speaks about her intimate affairs with men, her deepest physical desires, and so on and so forth. So it was a hot seller back then, and it drew a lot of controversy. And at a later point in her life, Kamala Das came to the forefront and admitted that most of the parts in that autobiography were fictitious in nature. While she was writing my story, she was in a financially deprived condition, and she wanted to make some good bucks. And she created some, fictitious elements, especially about her life, so as to sell books and make some money out of it. So, in that sense, apply this to that case, you would realize you would be misled if you look at the authorial intentions, even if the author claims that he or she means this. So he critiques the idea of originality and truth that one associates with the author. That is the second valid claim that Roland Barthes does. He critiques the idea of originality and truth that one associates with the author. You may again come across all the critical works that we have studied so far, and you would see that this debate is there. Genius, inborn talent, originality, the ancient versus the modern debate. If you remember me referring to Jonathan Swift's The Battle of the Books during the neoclassical period, it deals with this debate between the ancient and the modern. So Roland Barthes adds to that, and he critiques the idea of originality and truth that one stereotypically associates with the author. This approach of giving excessive authority to the author has various problems. This approach makes us take the biographical approach to read the text. This approach has two problems. One, it falsely assumes that one can uncover the intentions of the author. Two, that there is a fixed meaning of the text that one should try to find. So when you look at a book as original and truthful, another idea, another example that comes to my mind is Manu S. Pillai's works. Right? Based on historical studies, Manu S. Pillai brings up quite a lot of books. On the Ivory Throne was the latest, if I remember correctly. If you have read Manu S. Pillai, that is. So more often than not, people look at Manu S. Pillai as an authentic source and they read his books. I'm not criticizing him. I have quite a lot of free copies autographed by him because he happens to be a friend of my friend. So I'm not criticizing him, but I'm just taking him for an example. So imagine you read Manu S. Pillai as an authentic, original, truthful author. Or maybe I can also give one more example. There is this guy, of course, we Tamilians would be able to understand this guy quite easily, or those who have the habit of reading the New Indian Express, where he generally used to write reviews in Sunday Express. His name is Bharadwaj Rangan. I'm not sure how many of you have read him. He also writes in the Hindu, and currently he's into video interviews and blogging as well. He's a bald-headed fellow, so people who don't like him criticizing people and films call him Motai. Motai means bald-headed. They Motai. So Bharadwaj Rangan is regarded as one of the authentic film reviewers or film critics in India. So imagine you look at his writings as an authentic, truthful depiction. This approach has two problems. One, that you are falsely assuming that you can uncover the intentions of the author. Two, you are looking for a fixed meaning of the text that one should try to find. So both these can be deadly and dangerous according to Roland Barthes. Again, we can come back a little while later and disagree entirely to Barthes if you want. but I'm just putting forward his arguments for your comprehension. So Barth critiques this by suggesting that one should not see the author as some sort of divine creator who creates a text or meaning out of nothing or a vacuum, but sort of a collage maker who is putting together various pre-existing thoughts and ideas in a unique and skillful way. He says this importance given to the author as an original creator is recent or contemporary, as in earlier times, like in the times of Greeks. The focus was more on the narrative techniques and how a text is presented, and not in its original plot, as the most of the texts were coming from the same mythological stories that were presented in different ways by different authors. Well, that's a point that we should come back later and examine, because that is rather absurd, because it already has a rhetorical sense. I've already discussed that during our initial stages. During the Greek times, they had very selective stories. So every playwright came up with their own version of the same stories, and that's why Aristotle doesn't really discuss the stories, but rather the narrative techniques of play. So citing that, Barth argues that we shouldn't pay heed to these things, which is actually absurd, because in modern days we have quite a lot of stories to work on. Well, even though that can raise a question regarding originality and stuff like that. Okay. So therefore, Barth shifts the focus from the author to the reader. He's not interested in the true meaning of the text, as according to him, there is no such thing. Both the reader and author brings with them the preconceived knowledge and ideas that they have of certain things, which definitely affects their reading of the text. So there could be as different ways of reading and interpreting a text as there are a number of readers. Barth states at the end of the essay that he is more interested in proclaiming the birth of the reader than the death of the author.
So I missed out one point. No fixed meaning and
When was that?
so right now you said that according to him, like he said that there's no fixed meaning in a text, and one more point you mentioned.
Yeah, that was regarding, when we look for originality or truth with an author, there are two problems for that approach. One is we believe that one can uncover the intentions of the author. Second, we believe that there is a fixed meaning of the text that we should try to locate.
Okay, so thank you.
Yeah. So such an attempt is something that he is contemptuous about, or that he disregards. Okay. Now, before getting into the discussions of the problems with the death of the author concept, let me also add an appendix to this discussion. That's why I said S bar Z earlier. So later in his work S bar Z, the same Roland Barthes who said that the author is dead and the reader has the autonomy to interpret the text, comes up with the concept of readerly and writerly texts. So the paradox is that on one side he says that there is no author, but on the latter part he speaks of writerly texts and readerly texts. So this is a contradiction in itself. So now let me quickly take you to a few flaws or problems that we deal with when we try to agree to Roland Barthes. Well, this is not something that you would get from any of the World Wide Web. The book that I currently took in my hands is a good 12, 13-year-old book. This was my lecture note during my PG days when I was a postgraduate student like you. I used to take lecture notes while my teachers were lecturing. So it comes in handy even a decade later or a dozen years later. So this was the result of a discussion that we had. My batch, maybe taking me apart, my batch was quite a interactive batch as far as our teachers were concerned. So whenever we had a teacher who was interactive in nature, there were a good 5 to 6 people in my class who would immediately jump into and get into heated arguments. So that made my book pregnant because I had quite a lot to draw from whatever they said. So yeah, so I would like to add a few more to whatever we have discussed so far. And These are valid observations on the death of the author. So, in the death of the author, we could see that Barth takes an extreme stand by replacing author with reader. Such a stance can be seen in two ways. Either we can accuse Barth to have taken a utopian stance by entirely nullifying the role of the writer, author, or we can call that extreme stand as an idealistic stand from the position that he was in as a post-structuralist or an intermediary, to look at the author and say that meaning production should not be closed and it should be open-ended. In order to do that, reader autonomy should be activated. It could be deemed as an idealistic stance as well. Two, Roland Barthes speaks about lack of originality and genius. He says that there is nothing called originality or genius. Even for the sake of an argument, having studied literature in a traditional, stereotypical, canonical sense, you must also remember this word canon. Canon, right? Canon means arranging authors based on their hierarchy or based on their prominence. So that's why the moment we speak about English literature, we speak about Shakespeare, John Keats, Milton, and so on and so forth. Or when we speak about psychology, we speak about Sigmund Freud. So such a canon formation process is there. So we can't agree to Roland Barthes' statement that there is no originality and genius. It can't be supported by us. Then he also says that nothing is original. He goes on to say that everything is intertextual. Yes, in a postmodern or post-postmodern era, intertextuality gained quite a lot of significance, but we can't completely back Barthes in his argument. We can for sure say that genius exists. The moment we read Shakespeare, or the moment we look at a painting like Mona Lisa, or Picasso, or Van Gogh, we can instantly say that genius does exist. We cannot disregard this. So if we accept Roland Barthes, how would we approach such works? So that is a problematic postulation by Roland Barthes. And we can't say that a work is a copy. At least in classics, there is originality and genius. Again, I get reminded of John Milton's statement in Areopagitica. He says that every work is a lifeblood of a master spirit. Every work is a lifeblood of a master spirit, says Milton in his political pamphlet Areopagitica. We can't ignore that completely. So that lifeblood of a master spirit is what you call true genius or individual talent. So we cannot completely disregard that. Also, can we completely ignore a writer, his times, his socio-political, historical background? Social background of a work will definitely help us to understand a text better. Take the case of Charles Dickens, for that sake. Oliver Twist or Hard Times, David Copperfield, they all reflect the times as much as anything else. So if you disregard that entirely, how could you interpret that text? It's a highly problematic proposition. If we support his argument that the author is dead, then how can we approach discourses like autobiographies, diaries, journals, memoirs, biographies, and other life narratives? Take the classic example of Anne Frank's diary. Without understanding the political scenario between the two world wars, of the rise of Nazism and fascism in Italy and Germany, without understanding the Jewish massacre, without having an understanding of the concentration camp, how is it even possible to read Anne Frank's diaries? Or any other autobiographies or biographies for that sake. So that is one problem that again we have to face if we completely take Roland Barthes for granted. Because these narratives require to take into consideration several other facts. Especially when it comes to an autobiography, it is an author's work. But then I would also like to present an alternative thing, an alternate argument, especially while teaching MEG 14, where you have life writings as a module. I often discuss with my learners, maybe barring Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi's autobiography, My Experiments with Truth. I don't think any of the other autobiographies are 100% truth, right? Most of the autobiographies are, in Malayalam we say SP, Swayambongi, right? Self-promotion. I was this, I was that, I did this, I did that. These days, even any XYZ can write an autobiography. Days have come when we look at Sarita Nayar's autobiography, Swapna's autobiography, Jayashankar's autobiography. So, well, such is the doomed days that we live in. So how far do we trust their words? How far do we take into consideration their authorship? Right? And also, how far do we trust their memory? A valid point, Priti Agrawalji. How far do we depend on their memory? There is definitely a difference between me writing a work today about my experiences and me writing a work, let's say, another 10 to 15, 20 years later. It's going to be a real difficult scenario. So these are all major problems that we have to think about while taking Roland Barthes' arguments. But again, there are certain positives as well which we shouldn't disregard. First of all, it is Roland Barthes who has saved the reader from the tyranny of the author. Up until then, to a certain extent, texts were monotonous, texts were author-centric. And like somebody said, there could be interferences from the publishers and stakeholders and so many other people, the booksellers. So the reader is to a certain extent saved by Roland Barthes' interpretation of the death of the author. The reader is no more the slave of the author. Barthes opened a space for the reader to create meanings. Thus, in that sense, he has democratized reading by providing that space for reader interpretation, by nullifying the author's tyrannical role. He has democratized the process of reading. And that is one of the things that we need to bear in mind if we have to discuss or if we have to understand Roland Barthes' concept of the death of the author. I hope this is clear to you. If it be so,
Yes, sir.
yeah, very quickly, let's move on to Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault, teacher of all these little brats who made changes. Michel Foucault should be regarded in various senses, especially his work on power and privilege, his concepts like panopticon. Well, that is written. I don't think I can. As I told you, it's almost a decade or a dozen years old. So maybe बहुत मुश्किल से पढ़ रहा था उसको. So I'm not sure. Let me see. Anyway, so talking about Michel Foucault should be regarded for his concept of power. His concepts like panopticon. What is panopticon? Panopticon is that large tower in a jail where every time there is a surveillance being put in. So Foucault deals with these state authority, the way state governs us, the illusionary powers of state, and so on. He also did extensive studies, for instance, one on Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, his concepts on genealogy. And along with that, Foucault also ventured on this author question in his popular speech, What is an Author? To defend Roland Barthes. So he just like Barthes and S bar Z brought in writerly text and readerly text, Foucault brings in the two coinages called author function and reader function. He lists what are the roles of an author and what are the roles of a reader, thereby kind of balancing this criticism laid on Roland Barthes. So let's quickly have a look at an introduction on Foucault. I'll come back and maybe sum up a couple of concepts regarding Foucault, especially pertaining to the Saussurean concept of science and Roland Barthes' conceptions of author. And maybe we'll have not 15 minutes, but maybe 10 or 5 minutes of Q&A, in which I shall come back to those two questions as well. So just relax, watch this video. Foucault is an amazing character for you to look at. A really wide variety, full of life, an interesting personality to look at and admonish. So I'll come back and brief it because we have almost run out of time. I'll just brief his concepts and give it or call it a day.
Michel Foucault was a French 20th century philosopher and historian who spent his career forensically criticizing the power of the modern bourgeois capitalist state, including its police, law courts, prisons, doctors and psychiatrists. His goal was to work out nothing less than how power worked and then to change it in the direction of a Marxist anarchist utopia. Though he spent most of his life in libraries and seminar rooms, he was a committedly revolutionary figure. He met with enormous popularity in elite Parisian intellectual circles. Jean-Paul Sartre admired him deeply, and he still maintains a wide following among young people studying at university in the prosperous corners of the world. His background, which he was extremely reluctant ever to talk about and tried to prevent journalists from investigating at all costs, was very privileged. Both his parents were inordinately rich, coming from a long line of successful surgeons in Poitiers in west-central France. His father, Dr. Paul Foucault, came to represent all that Michel would hate about bourgeois France. Michel had a standard upper-class education. He went to elite Jesuit institutions, was an altar boy, and his parents hoped he would become a doctor. But Michel wasn't quite like other boys. He started self-harming and thinking constantly of suicide. At university, he decorated his bedroom with images of torture by Goya. When he was 22, he tried to commit suicide and was forced by his father, against his will, to see France's most famous psychiatrist, Jean Delay, at the Hôpital Sainte-Anne in Paris. The doctor wisely diagnosed that a lot of Michel's distress came from having to keep his homosexuality, and in particular his interest in extreme sadomasochism, away from a censorious society. Gradually, Foucault entered the underground gay scene in France, fell in love with a drug dealer, and then took up with a transvestite. For long periods in his 20s, he went to live abroad in Sweden, Poland and Germany, where he felt his sexuality would be less constrained. All the while, Foucault was progressing up the French academic ladder. The seismic event of his intellectual life came in the summer of 1953, when Foucault was 27 and on holiday with a lover in Italy. There he came across Nietzsche's book Untimely Meditations, which contains an essay called On the Uses and Abuses of History for Life. In the essay, Nietzsche argued that academics had poisoned our sense of how history should be read and taught. They made it seem as if one should read history in some sort of a disinterested way in order to learn how it all was in the past. But Nietzsche rejected this with sarcastic fury. There was no point learning about the past for its own sake. The only reason to read and study history is to dig out from the past ideas, concepts and examples which can help us to lead a better life in our own times. This essay liberated Foucault intellectually, as nothing had till then. Immediately, he changed the direction of his work and decided to become a particular kind of philosophical historian, someone who could look back into the past to help to sort out the urgent issues of his own time. 8 years later, he was ready to publish what's recognized as his first masterpiece, Madness and Civilization. The standard view is that we now treat people with mental illness in so much more of a humane way than we ever did in the past. After all, we put them in hospitals, give them drugs, and get them looked after by people with PhDs. But this was exactly the attitude that Foucault wished to demolish in Madness and Civilization. In the book, he argued that things way back in the Renaissance were actually far better for the mad than they subsequently became. In the Renaissance, the mad were felt to be different rather than crazy. They were thought to possess a kind of wisdom because they demonstrated the limits of reason. They were revered in many circles and were allowed to wander freely. But then, as Foucault's historical researches showed him, in the mid-17th century a new attitude was born that relentlessly medicalized and institutionalized mentally ill people. No longer were they allowed to live alongside the so-called sane. They were taken away from their families and locked up in asylums and seen as people one should try to cure rather than tolerate for just being different. You can recognize a very similar underlying philosophy in Foucault's next great book, The Birth of the Clinic. His target here was medicine more broadly. He systematically attacked the view that medicine had become more humane with time. He conceded that, of course, we have better drugs and treatments now, but he believed that in the 18th century the professional doctor was born and that he was a sinister figure who would look at the patient always with what Foucault called the medical gaze, denoting a dehumanizing attitude that looked at a patient just as a set of organs, not a person. One was, under the medical gaze, merely a malfunctioning kidney or liver, not a person to be considered as a whole entity. Next in Foucault's oeuvre came Discipline and Punish. Here Foucault did his standard thing on state punishment. Again, the normal view is that the prison and punishing systems of the modern world are so much more humane than they were in the days when people just used to be hung in public squares. Not so, argued Foucault. The problem, he said, is that power now looks kind, but isn't, whereas in the past it clearly wasn't kind, and therefore could encourage open rebellion and protest. Foucault noted that in the past, at an execution, a convict's body could become a focus of sympathy and admiration, and the executioner, rather than the convict, could become the locus of shame. Also, public executions often led to riots in support of the prisoner. But with the invention of the modern prison system, everything happened in private, behind locked gates. One could no longer see and therefore resist state power. That's what made the modern system of punishment so barbaric and properly primitive in Foucault's eyes. Foucault's last work was the multi-volume History of Sexuality. The maneuvers he performed in relation to sex are again very familiar. Foucault rebelled against the view that we're all now deeply liberated and at ease with sex. He argued that since the 18th century, we have relentlessly medicalized sex, handing it over to professional sex researchers and scientists. We live in an age of what Foucault called scientia sexualis, science of sexuality. But Foucault looked back with considerable nostalgia to the cultures of Rome, China, and Japan, where he detected the rule of what he called an ars erotica, erotic art, where the whole focus was on how to increase the pleasure of sex rather than merely understand and label it. Once again, modernity was blamed for pretending there'd been progress when there was in fact just a loss of spontaneity and imagination. Foucault wrote the last volume of this work while dying of AIDS that he had contracted in a San Francisco gay bar. He died in 1984, age 58. Foucault's lasting contribution is to the way we look at history. There are lots of things in the modern world that we're constantly being told are fantastic and were apparently very bad in the past, for example, education or the media or our communication systems. Foucault encourages us to break away from our optimistic smugness about now and to go back and see in history many ways of doing things which were perhaps superior. Foucault wasn't trying to get us to be nostalgic. He wanted us to pick up some lessons of way back in order to improve how we live now. Academic historians have tended to hate Foucault's work. They think it inaccurate and keep pointing out things he hadn't quite understood in some document or other. But Foucault didn't care for total historical accuracy. History for him was just a storehouse of good ideas, and he wanted to raid it rather than keep it pristine and untouched. We should use Foucault as an inspiration to look at the dominant ideas and institutions of our times, and to question them by looking at their histories and evolutions. Foucault did something remarkable. He made history life-enhancing and philosophically rich again. He can be an inspiring figure for our own projects.
All right, so that was a brief sum up of what Foucault is or Foucault was, and for the time being, just to add to what we discussed yesterday, I'd like to add Michel Foucault's concept of this is not a pipe. Let me just share my screen again and show you a picture. All right. So look how it challenges the stereotypical notions of our brain. The moment we look at this, as per whose theory is this a pipe? As per whose theory is this a pipe? The sound image brings to the mind a picture. Ferdinand de Saussure, right? So look how he plays with the Saussurean notion. There is a pipe, but then the caption is this is not a pipe. So he questions received notions of representation in art by engaging a number of artworks by Belgian surrealist painter René Magritte. He argues that within modernity, people are falsely positioned within an established system of seeing that links reality with visual representation. Magritte's painting of a pipe, combined with the painted words, "This is not a pipe," calls into question visual representational belief, such as, in as much as what is painted on canvas is not actually a pipe, but a depiction of a pipe. The legend or explanatory title, which is wholly part of the artwork and not in its customary marginal frame, serves to point up the artifice of the conventional equivalency between a pipe and the image of a pipe. Important to his analysis, important to Foucault's analysis, is the distinction between resemblance and similitude in visual representation. In saying that an image resembles reality, one assumes the ontological superiority of the latter. With similitude, however, the objective referent is gone. Things and images are more or less like one another without any of them being able to claim the privileged status of model for the rest. As translator Harkness characterizes Foucault and Magritte in his introduction, both engage in a critique of language, the former hysterico-epistemological, the latter visual. Each in his own way concurs with the linguist Saussure in asserting the arbitrariness of the sign. So this is one concept that I wanted you to be aware of regarding Foucault in terms of Saussurean sign signifier signified. I would also like you to Google these two concepts, simulation and simulacra, by Baudrillard, who historically claims that the Gulf War never happened. You may read that if you want as well. The Gulf War never happened, or was it took place? I don't remember exactly, but then, yeah, that's one work that I would recommend you to have a look at and have a further understanding. All right. And one more story I forgot to tell you is I was talking to you about the reader autonomy being activated by Roland Barthes throughout today's session. So another couple of appendix additions that I could give to your information is that during the postmodern era, quite a lot of writers experimented with the art form of writing. An example that immediately comes to my mind is Donald Barthelme's Snow White. Not the Walt Disney Snow White, mind you. Donald Barthelme's Snow White is a novel which is a parody of Disney's Snow White. It looks at Snow White as a normal being in a way molested by the dwarfs, and how she had to force into a living, and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's because they, as I told you, they belong to a different country. For instance, Roland Barthes is Barthes, but we call him Barthes. And Jacques Derrida is actually Jacques Derrida in terms of the spelling. But then I'm using the pronunciation because that could come in handy when you later speak about him to someone else. If I say Jacques, you would end up saying Jacques in an interview. And the interviewer would say that he doesn't know anything. So that's why I'm trying to make to stick to those standards as and when and where I can. All right. So I was telling that in certain works that are postmodern in nature, they experimented with fiction. There was intertextuality, there was metafiction being introduced, and there were pages which the reader had to fill if he had to continue the process of reading. The pages were left blank for the reader to fill, or there were puzzles or sudokus for the reader to engage to proceed further. So there were texts that came in postmodern period. There were novels and texts that emerged in postmodern period, which engaged the reader in the process of reading. Reading couldn't be a non-active process. Reading had to be active if one has to complete a postmodern novel. Of course, it lacked most of these stereotypical conventions. Sometimes it lacked a proper beginning, a proper title, a proper end. So these writers played or toyed with these conventions. Another classic example that comes to my mind is, if you haven't read this, it's a must read, a classic. Italo Calvino's If on a winter's night a traveler I would recommend you to read that novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. Again, I'm speaking from my memory. I could be wrong. If I remember correctly, that novel has 20 or 22 chapters. So what happens in that novel is every first or odd chapter, or is it the even chapter? I forgot that. Okay, one, let's say odd and even. So every odd chapter is a metafiction, a story, and every even chapter is a narrative, or vice versa. Every odd chapter is a narrative, and every even chapter is a story. So in the odd chapter, where it is, what happens is the novel begins by saying, you are about to read If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino. Please be seated at a comfortable position, if possible at a calm space. Tell everyone that you are going to read If on a Winter's Night a Traveler and you need peace, quiet, calm. Ask your family members to shut down the TV, shut the door, or even yell to them and ask them to be quiet. Then come back, take a position, and start reading. You are about to read If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. And as that progresses, so initial part, what do you think? You are the protagonist, you are reading the novel. No. After a couple of paragraphs, that you is the central character of a novel. The protagonist is addressed as you, you. So you is involved in the process of reading. And then the even chapters come. Even chapters are individual stories. So as he proceeds reading, he sees that the title is misprinted. Let's say the third chapter's title is in the second chapter, and the second chapter is in the third chapter or fourth chapter for that sake. And he could see that there are quite a lot of spelling mistakes, printing mistakes, gaps, and there is an entire chapter which is blank. So when there is a whole 1 or 2, 3 pages blank, what would you do? You would think that it's a printing mistake in your copy, so you would go back to the bookstore and give it back. So the you goes back to the bookshop and he tries to return the book. And he finds out that there are quite a lot of other readers who have come back with the same problem. And the bookshop owner apologetically says that he has sought for a republication that hasn't arrived yet. So please go back with this copy for the time being. I'll let you know when the new copy arrives. So there, the central character meets the heroine. Her name is Ludmilla. He and her exchange their details, especially number, so that they can contact each other if they come early and they figure out that the new book has arrived. So they go back home, and the process of reading continues. And by the time you reach the end of the novel, these two people have romanced and they have got married. Mind you, they went to pick a book and the book was faulty and they have started to have a relationship. By the time the book is about to reach its end, they are married, and she's asking him to close the book, turn off the lights, and come and sleep with her. To which he replies, "Just a minute, I'm just about to complete the reading of the book If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino." That's how the novel ends. So that signifies that novel is, or reading is, not a complete process. It's an incomplete process. It takes quite a lot of problems. It is affected by the printing industry, the publication industry, their vested interests, then a lot of other factors like these things. So in connection to Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author, If on a Winter's Night is a novel that I would recommend you all to read. Well, on that note, I leave the floor open. We have, about 10 minutes of time for your questions and answers. No, questions and discussions. Yeah. Anybody? Okay, in the meanwhile, as you think about your doubts and what to ask, let me clarify the two questions that came across while I was teaching. One was about phonocentrism. The other was regarding organic unity. Organic unity is a term, as you had mentioned, which was central to the new critics. Especially it's Cleanth Brooks, if I remember correctly, in his work, The Well-Wrought Urn. The Well-Wrought Urn. It is in the first chapter of that book that The Language of Paradox was published. So in his book, The Well-Wrought Urn, um, Cleant Brooks talks about the need for an organic unity in a work. So when it comes to a piece of literature, there should be an organic unity between the theme and the structure of the poem. In our body, there should be an organic unity between what we have that makes us walk or stay properly or stand upright or sit upright. So such an organic unity is sought by the new critics. It is very central to them. Regarding the second one, that is phonocentrism, it is the beliefs that it is a belief system that sounds and speech are inherently superior to written language or sign language, or in simple terms, giving primacy to speech over writing. Yes, Anchal Kumariji, go on.
Sir, the organic unity is different from the organic whole that Plato has prescribed.
See, again, I would like to remind you that across the ages, people have brought in concepts based on what they are trying to communicate. So sometimes there is no point in drawing an analogy. But more than whatever it is, these new critics are trying to disregard the entire, what do you call, textual analysis based on the moral, philosophical, psychological, historical aspects. So their focus is on the text. So definitely it cannot be Plato's, right? Plato's organic unity has a lot to do with a moral function. Plato is talking about poets being immoral, right? Am I clear?
Okay, thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, yeah. So it seems that you don't have
Excuse
much.
me.
Yes, please, Param.
Regarding this theory of death of the author and rise of the reader.
Reader. Both of the reader, yeah.
Yeah. How this can be applied to also, as you pointed out, how it can be applied to all genre of writing, and how it can be said as a theory, because this, or they should say for this type of writing, this can be applied, or some type of writing this can be applied, but like history, science, this type of, how we can apply this theory to the, it can be generalized to all writing. Is
Yeah,
it possible?
precisely, Param. That's what I discussed at the end of my lecture. I spoke to you about the difficulties in
Yeah,
acknowledging
yeah,
most of these arguments,
yes,
especially
yes,
regarding talent and genius, and
yes,
regarding how we would read an autobiography.
yes,
Take the case of diary.
yes,
Sorry. Forget Anne Frank's diary. Forget you writing a diary and
yes, yes,
us getting to read it. So how can we read it without understanding who you are, what you are,
yes,
and
yes,
your personal and historical facts, your
yeah,
familial
yeah, yeah,
details,
yes.
right?
My question is
Forget all,
how it came to
forget
be.
all that. No,
Uh,
forget all that. I'll give you. I'll end that in a simple repartee question. If Roland Barthes is to be accepted and agreed, okay. If we agree to Roland Barthes that the author is dead the moment the book is written,
yes.
okay, how can we agree to Roland Barthes? Because Roland Barthes is dead, right? That's a principal problem there. If we have
Correct.
to agree that the author is dead and the reader is the entity,
Yes,
then the essay that of the author is nullified.
yes, yes.
Why
Yeah,
again? Also remember the crime or the inevitable thing that we teachers do also is that we teach that of the author as a post-structuralist essay or something between structuralism and post-structuralism. So if Barth has to be taken into account, we shouldn't be doing that. We should be talking about the work in isolation.
yes,
But we can't do that because this is again in contrast to whatever was said until structuralism, what is
yeah,
said by
yeah,
Saussure. So
yeah,
a different sort of meaning production is being emphasized.
yeah.
Yeah.
That is my question,
So that is why. So that is why. That is exactly why I took a good 33 minutes to get started. If you remember, there were two
Yeah,
videos from mythology for
yeah,
the precise reason that this man has made sense in a lot of other domains. You go
yeah.
and read Camera Lucida. This man would make us cry.
Mhm.
So he has powers elsewhere. You go and read Toys. Toys would make us think that this guy is an outright sexist or feminist. So
Yes,
there are essays and works where he has really convincingly done the job.
yeah.
Maybe here somehow he's messed things up. I'm not sure because I was not alive back then. I can only speak based on the experiences of the lectures that I've had or whatever I have read. So there are limitations to comment, monotonously on those lines. But then
Yeah.
this is my interpretation of Barth.
Yeah. Now, my question is how it came about to how it came to be accepted by all, because this is
No,
like a self-contradictory.
no,
This is how
not
it can
see.
be a theory, how it can
No, no,
be
that's
this.
that's why I said there was a conference in which this meaning formation things were discussed. So post-Saussurean, post-structuralist people joined there and they had their own papers. So Derrida's was one paper. We'll discuss that in the next class and you'll have a better clarity. So Derrida makes a lot more sense when he speaks
Yeah.
about the structure, sign, and the interplay in search of meanings. So
Yeah.
on a similar platform, Roland Barthes puts in his own formulations. Another two examples that I can bring, another analogy. I didn't say that because it'll become too much for you. A couple of other examples that I can give you is that M.H. Abrahams had a lecture which later came published, came to be published as The Mirror and the Lamp. You may read that if you have time. And the same series of lecture or that conference saw a talk by Hillis Miller, J. Hillis Miller, who has a speech titled Critic as Host. And among all this, critic as host is also something I would recommend you to read. A 3 to 4 page essay, if you Google it. It speaks about the role of a critic as a parasite. It gives an interesting read. Though Hillis Miller is not that oft discussed. I really wonder why is it that Hillis Miller doesn't get discussed as much as the other three people. So these are a few references that I have for you as we somewhat wind up today's session.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep. So guys, as I told you, we will be meeting again next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 5:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. The link remains the same. And please spread the word and make sure people are there. I understand that there was another parallel ongoing lecture on MEG 3 at 6 p.m. today from some other center. That's why we don't have most of our learners today. But please tell them to join on Tuesday and Wednesday because we'll be discussing about Derrida, post-structuralism. We'll be discussing about the evolution of feminism, which involves all those units in that block, starting from Mary Wollstonecraft to Elaine Showalter. And then if we get time, we'll be discussing post-colonialism, Sir Sigmund Freud, and also the other one, what is it? Marxism, if we get time, that is. So I leave it to you. If you are free, I would acknowledge your presence because it really gives a lot of pleasure to see quite a lot of people participating in the class. Whether you open your mic or not, whether you speak or not, the moment you start saying something, or the moment I see a good 70, 80 people, that's really a pleasure to interact with. And that really boosts us up when it comes to taking such classes. So it is just a gentle request. There is nothing more than that. If you can come and attend regularly, you may also be able to follow the concepts because I am kind of following a chronology while discussing these topics with you. You may go back to your blogs and you can see that I'm going one after the other. So that will be helpful to you later when you go back and have a look at all these things. And one more link I have to share is I had told you other day about listening to poems. So some people would misunderstand it to be listening to only poems, but no. Now I have a link, an audiobook of The Death of the Author. So if you're so bored or so reluctant to read The Death of the Author, you may go and listen to that audio, 16 minutes long. Listen to it before sleeping. I'm sure it would serve as a paracetamol or whatever sleeping pill would befit that. So listen to that, and I'm sure maybe in 7 or 8 minutes you will doze off. Come back the other day, read again, listen again, and doze off. So yeah, thank you everyone.